Okay, I'm trying this. Let's see if it holds. I'm here. Am I here? Oh my goodness, I think I'm here. And so far, oh, this is good. I'm not, you know what? I'm not having any flashes of poor connection. I think I'm actually here, but I was poorly connected before. In short, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Apologies for the delay. My technology was giving me grief. And, there's only so much you can yell at your screen. Oh, that's good. I am here. Excellent. Yay. Oh, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. It's another Tuesday Instagram live stream artist chat, where I get to do a really cool thing, which is just talk with really cool creators and change makers out there in the world to learn more about them, what they do, why they do what they do. And today we have an extra special guest who's been extraordinarily patient with me, although all our guests are extra special. Let's be honest here. Today we're talking with Dr. Anna Rodrigues, who is just a super awesome human being who loves and is passionate about what they call public art interventions. So some of us might call that different things. We might know it by different words and experience it and engage with it in lots of different ways. But before I dive into that, why don't I let Anna explain that all for herself. So hello, everyone. Let's invite Anna on. There we go. That request off now, and hopefully she'll be with us in a moment. Wow, that was a stressful start, everyone. I'm so sorry. But I have my tea. I'm feeling like, you know what, everything from here on is going to be smooth sailing. We'll see. That was me knocking on wood, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with that. But how are folks doing out there? It's good to see so many familiar, friendly faces. Oh, please let this work. Every few months, this is something that happens with our live streams. We're super excited about a guest. We have trouble getting online. And then there's this weird thing where the technical powers that be say, no, not today. But we're hoping that today it will work. And you know what? Oh, so what I'm going to do is send another request out there to Anna. And Anna, you can also send me a request to join the live stream if you're out there watching. So if this isn't working, let's try that. One of those days. Let's everyone. And this has been so interesting. We've had what over? Oh my gosh!
Here I am.
Anna. What is happening out there?
Can you hear me? Okay.
How are you doing?
I'm fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. I clicked on something and then it said my microphone was not enabled. So I left to enable that. And then when I came back, I was no longer. So I sent in a request to join.
Lovely. I'm so glad you did. Thank you. See, this is lovely. All of us just going with the flow, flying by the seat of our pants, all of those terms. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to finally join and that I was able to finally get this up and running, because you're someone that I'm just so thrilled to introduce the community to. Now, I gave a sort of shoddy intro there at the beginning, but can you perhaps, to folks who might not be familiar with who you are or what you do, let people know, just introduce yourself to everyone who's watching and listening.
Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, Mary, for inviting me to this artist chat. So my name is Anna Rodrigues, and I've been an educator for a long time. But many years ago, I actually worked in journalism and broadcasting, and that's what actually led me to teach. So I taught at Durham College for 12 years, and then I went back to school and did graduate studies and got my PhD in education. And I really fell in love with education, but I'm still very much like my hands, or my, whatever you call it, my toes are in two worlds, like education and communication. And so I kind of meshed the two together by doing research, looking at the time, feminist street art. But I've actually kind of expanded the kind of works that I'm looking at, and I call it public art interventions, because I'm looking at so much more than just street art. I look at murals that are created legally. I look at posters. I really look at I look at advertising and billboards as well. That's part of my research.
Hmm.
But the whole idea is that anything that is kind of like public communication that you might find walking down the street is what I'm really interested in. Even in rock art, which has really come about like since COVID-19. I go hiking, I see all sorts of interesting pieces that people are leaving, and that's now something that I've turned my attention to as well. So longtime educator, very interested in public communication, and then I take photographs of all of these things that I encounter,
Yeah.
and I guess that's me in a nutshell.
That's so much in a very extremely interesting nutshell. So I love that. This is one of the things that strikes me about you and the work that you do, and just how your appreciation of that creative force that is out there that so many of us refer to as street art, because like so many things, we tend to think of it in one way, assume street art is only one thing. But so why do you think street art, that term, has kind of been narrowed down over time to only refer to things like murals or, you know, graffiti writing or things like that?
It's really complicated. So I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and there was a huge debate about terms.
Hmm.
So it's interesting because, for example, something that I perceive as street art, somebody else will look at it and say that's graffiti arts. For example, in Brazil, what I perceive as street art is called graffiti art, but
Hmm.
it's something that I would look at and say, I think to me that's street art. So I think that the terms, everyone is kind of coming at it with their own background experiences. People that are looking from the outside, you know, just kind of like learning more about it, haven't, a lot of people tell me I never even noticed things that were on the walls. To me, it's all vandalism. And
Hmm.
sometimes when I talk about it and say, oh, well, there's a message here, or this artist is trying to communicate, so they start to look at it more carefully. But I've also had people tell me, to me, it's all graffiti. To me, it's all street art. To me, it's all tagging. So it's like all in everything, like all these terms are like in one basket. I think for that's why I felt like when I was looking at it, and I knew that I wasn't just researching street art. It didn't seem right for me to say I'm just looking at street art. I thought of some terms, and I actually did some research, and I couldn't find anything that I was happy with. So I said, I'm going to call it public art interventions because it's public, it's art, and it's an intervention. It's an intervention that could be permanent, for there for a long time, or
Yeah.
sorry, for forever, maybe not so permanent, and maybe it's gone within an hour of somebody creating it. And if
Yeah.
somebody happened to take a photo, then we can, you know, it has a sort of permanent spot now in history. But I felt that it kind of would work better for me. And now when I talk about it, or I write about it, or talk to someone, I always say, this is my definition. These are the things that I see as part of it, including even like public art, public performance.
Hmm.
And it's all encompassing, and it's more, to me, it feels better because the research that I'm doing is not just looking at street art. And a lot of times people will say, oh, street art, Banksy, like they make that connection right away. And I always say, well, there's a lot more to street art than just Banksy. But yeah, definitely that is the type of socio-political works that I look at. And I was looking specifically for my research when I was doing my dissertation, feminist street art. So street art that were created by people who identified as feminists.
Okay, I have so many questions. Where do I begin? All right, so let's circle back to that specific thing, the idea of feminist street art, and I suppose creating equity, or identifying or acknowledging equity where in the community where we see it with regards to that. But how did you come to this field of research? What was it about public art interventions that sparked this desire in you?
Well, it comes from a really young age, when I started to look at walls to kind of make sense of the world around me.
Mm.
And so I was born in Canada, but when I was a year old, my parents moved to California, and then we lived there for 10 years, and then they moved back to their birth country, Portugal. But
Mm.
when I actually moved back, I didn't speak Portuguese. English was my first language, and I kind of understood my parents, but we actually moved to an area where I couldn't understand because it was just a different dialect. And so I had a lot of trouble communicating the way I used to. with people by talking, reading, and writing. I couldn't do that in Portuguese, and it took me a long time, but I was nonetheless taken from school in California and put into a school in Portugal without, and they're like, oh, you'll be fine. My parents were like, oh yeah, you'll be fine. And the teachers were like, you'll be fine, you'll catch up. But it was hard. And so I found that a lot of times I would look at pictures in books to make sense of things. So comics and something that's called fotonovelas, where it's like stories that are told through photos, was something that as I became a teenager, I'd look at these stories. They're mostly about romance. But I would look at the pictures and I would kind of look at the words and make meaning that way. But I took a lot of time looking at the walls because I would see a lot of like political posters on walls and things painted. And I loved looking and kind of saying, what is that person trying to say with that poster? What is that person trying to say with that, the 3 words on a wall? And so I think that's where my love of looking at walls and trying to make meaning from what I was seeing in terms of public and anonymous works on walls is where I then was inspired to do this sort of research. And then I was at Ontario Tech to do my Master of Ed. And literacy is very important to me as well, because as an adult, I moved back to Canada and I found myself, I was a person of low literacy. Eventually, I didn't speak Portuguese well enough or English well enough to say that I spoke fluently one language. I'm known as, at that time, as a person who was semi-lingual. So I had parts of 2 different languages. And it's a little bit different from code switching, because when you do code switching, which I do now, it's because you have a good grasp of 2 languages. So when you're speaking to somebody who knows the 2 languages, you just switch back and forth without effort. But semi-lingualism is a bit different. And so I actually had to kind of learn not only English, because that I think I caught quickly, but like cultural norms, because I had been living in a different country. I remember like even filling out a form was really difficult for me, like a work form. It was something that was so alien to me. I'd never encountered it at the age of 20. And so all of these things, again, I really relied on visuals to get me through, and like, okay, visually try and understand something quickly so I can get through. And then when I was doing my master's, as I said, I had a great interest in literacy, and I was taking a course called Digital Literacies with Dr. Jeanette Hughes. And we needed to do a project that had to do with a sort of alternative literacy. And I approached her and I said, well, what if I looked at like street art and tagging and graffiti? Would that work? And she said, yeah, for sure. So I did my project looking specifically at street art. And then from there, when I decided I was going to do doctoral work, I just carried on that research, and it just became a little bit bigger, and my interest just in that area continued to grow.
I think what's jumping out at me there is this idea that one, art is everywhere. It's everywhere. And I think wherever we are in the world, we can make assumptions. We tend to make assumptions and take certain things for granted, and sometimes miss out on identifying the common ground. Like we might assume that graffiti writing or street art is the same the world over, but it's not. Or we might assume that posters or things that we consider that, blend into the environment, like political posters or advertising campaigns, are the same as what we experience here, but they're not. And if you're suddenly moved from where you are into another environment, something that might be boring and dull and run of the mill for someone else because they're used to seeing it every day becomes creative, becomes art, becomes something completely new to that person who finds themselves there, and thus worthy of investigation and investing time in. And then again, the common ground that we all share. It seems like there is this art being created wherever we go, whether it's on a wall or painting a rock or it's like slapping up a sticker on a wall. And it's all communication. It's all education, potentially something that can do that for someone out there like yourself.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like public communication on walls is something that has existed for many years. It started with caves and that kind of thing, but it exists in every country, and a lot of people associate it with urban areas. But I find, just as I was saying, rock art, I find evidence of people communicating with others anonymously everywhere, rural areas. Sometimes it is anonymous, sometimes it's not. But there's all sorts of different art forms that are happening. I live in a rural area now after living in Toronto and then in Oshawa for a number of years. So we're just outside of Peterborough. But there's something really amazing that I find in these rural areas, which are the barn squares. And people are communicating stories. And I'm not sure if that's the right terminology, but I call them barn squares. So a lot of the different barns will have what looks like a quilt square. Maybe somebody in the audience has the right name and they can pop it in there. But what I found out from speaking to someone, and I'd love to do more research, is that a lot of these barn squares that you just see that people attach to their barns are actually telling a history of the barn or the area where their barn is located. Like there's a sort of narrative that's attached to it. So it's not happens, it's not just, oh, I'm just going to put up this square here. There's a whole history behind it. So again, I'm just fascinated by public communication, and whether a lot of it being anonymous even makes it more fascinating, because then I feel like it's unfiltered. Somebody had something to say and they weren't scared to say it in any way, or forced to say something in particular. That these are their true thoughts, because it's anonymous, and they are taking, essentially it's a crime still. If that wall doesn't belong to you, you could get into big trouble.
Yeah.
But they are taking that chance to put that information out there because it's important to them. So I find that really fascinating as well.
It is fascinating that there's a certain challenging ourselves to share, that there's this vulnerability that comes with sharing. Sometimes it's just I hope people like this. What if they don't? Oh my goodness, that inner critic voice. And at other times the stakes are much higher. I think even in where we live right now, even if you own a wall, you can't do whatever you want with it. That
That's
it has
true.
to be something that is appealing to everyone around you. Or it also can't be something that's construed as an advertisement or have language on it that might, there's all these little tricky things that come along, all these bylaws that come along with public, like what is, something that is shared with the public. And yet people still take risks to get their voices out there.
Yes, for sure. And something I look at is, it's a theory in education called public pedagogy, which is the learning that happens out of formal institutions such as colleges, universities, elementary, high school, that kind of thing. What do we learn from outside of those institutions that are associated with learning? And so I saw when I was in Brazil, taking as part of a field course that was happening there for students from Ontario Tech. And we went to Beco de Batman, which is an area where people create street art on the walls that don't belong to them, belong to the people that live in those alleyways and that kind of thing. But there was a gentleman who, after a number of years of having the walls, his walls painted, or street art being painted or postered or whatever, he painted everything gray. And so there was an immediate response, by artists and people that live in the community. But he said he was just getting tired of people walking through and making noise. You get lots of tourists walking through. He was saying people go at night, and they were and he just said, the walls are mine. I can do whatever I want with them. So if I want to paint them gray, I'm going to paint them gray. So the day that we were there, the walls had already been painted gray, but a street artist, his name is Nero, he came and he was painting something on the gray wall. And then the owner came out and they chatted, and I actually recorded a bit of this. And I wasn't the only one. There were lots of people watching this whole interaction. And I think by the end, I think he asked the artist, what are you going to create on the wall? And the artist explained his vision. But it kind of, I thought it was interesting. I wrote a little kind of short paper on it, just kind of bringing up some ideas of, like, if you live in a community like this, are those walls really yours? These bring up very interesting questions. If it's a wall that is in a community where many people go by it and can see it, and you could use that wall, or somebody could use that wall to inform somebody, to educate someone, whose wall really is it? You know, do we have the right to say this is my wall if it's that sort of community? And I think it just brought up all street art or any sort of public art intervention brings up these questions about what is public and what is private. And of course, we have in our Western viewpoint is that what we own is ours, and it's very private, and we own our walls and we own our houses. But many other sort of viewpoints on life are in contrast to that. So worldview is very different in terms of who owns what. And many people might see that a wall in a community that everyone kind of walks by, that the community shares, although it belongs to that person, maybe it doesn't, maybe it belongs to the whole community. Maybe we should look at it that way. So anyway, I don't have answers to these questions. It's just more about like these public art interventions bringing up these questions about the public and the private. And sorry, I was just reading a comment from someone. It also brings up the question, given the noise levels of the tourists, about entering a community politely to engage with the art. Exactly. So the day I was there, I was really like, I was told that we weren't even at a time when it was really busy. It was starting to get like hard to walk down these alleyways because so many people wanted to see the art and take pictures. There was this whole performance thing of, I want this beautiful mural behind me, or I want this specific piece of art.
Yeah, and Zombie Art Squad, who is an extraordinary artist in the community, bylaws dictate what I can paint on my garage door. Zombie Art Squad does all these incredible things with his garage door, and yeah, sometimes it has to be changed in the past. And it seems to demonstrate a lack of communication and a lack of clarity, or some gaps that potentially can be bridged between, community members to work together to learn about what they can create and what they want to see, or what needs to be seen in some cases. Like you were mentioning yesterday when we were chatting about the art in the east side of Vancouver when COVID first, hit everyone, and they thought, well, how do you connect and educate and raise awareness about what's happening? And there was this public arts intervention with regards to spreading the word to that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you learned about that process?
Yes, so I think it was in April of 2020 when a public social somebody who works with the community. So I don't know, they're an activist, but also they're a social worker that works with the community, partnered with an artist, and they created a mural that was to inform people about COVID. And so the idea behind it was that this is an area where a lot of people are experiencing homelessness, but it's also an area where even if somebody does have a home, they may not have access to a phone with the internet. They may not have, data. They may not have access to a radio or TV. And if you recall, and still it's happening, but all these public service announcements informing us on how to stay safe were online or were on TV. They were on some form of media. And of course, when libraries closed down, a lot of people who rely on, going to the library to take a look at something on a computer, they couldn't do that. So that was a great example, I think, of informing the community, understanding the needs of the community, understanding how best to communicate with them, and putting up this mural. And I think the artist's name is Smokey D, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I remember seeing the mural online, and then I wrote about how we needed to look more closely at what I call COVID-19 street art. Not me, it's other people are calling it that as well. But what we call COVID-19 street art, which is street art or graffiti or public art interventions that have been created specifically in response to the pandemic. And some of it is sort of reassuring. Other pieces are to thank people that are doing incredible jobs during this very difficult time. Essential workers and people, all those people that are helping us stay safe. And then other pieces are about informing people, such as, I saw a lot of chalk art in my community, and I was living in Oshawa at the time, lots of chalk art saying, stay at home, and also words of encouragement such as, not only stay safe and stay home, but we'll get through this. It's a beautiful day. Try and think of the good, positive things. Lots of sort of what I call encourage memos, which I've
Yeah.
seen a lot that comes through chalk art. And I thought to myself at that time, again, something really interesting. And if there's any researchers that are listening to us now or interested in getting into research, there's like so much that can be looked at in terms of public art interventions. But I wondered about people who had never taken a piece of chalk to write on a sidewalk,
Yeah.
never painted a rock and put it in a public space, what they were thinking of those actions that COVID had kind of encouraged them to create these public art interventions.
Or people putting things in their windows or painting on their windows. Like there was this whole new thing. And this kind of relates to the question that Levislug 2 is asking. Is there a larger conversation about middle class Canada and art? Canadians have traditionally been very culturally resistant to art interventions. And that makes me think, like, are there different standards about what people consider appropriate or not appropriate when creating these kind of pieces, and who creates them and why they create them? I don't know. What do you think about that?
So when I talk to educators about, because my research is a lot of the research I do is like looking at public art interventions through the lens of public pedagogy. So what can we learn from this? And I encourage educators to use it in the classroom, but to also not stay away, but don't always go back to Banksy. That's like too easy. And we know what she does, they do, or that group of people do, because nobody's really sure who they are, but it's fine. But try and look at people who are creating in the community, perhaps where the school is located, if they want to bring it in. And educators will tell me, well, there's nothing like that happening. So I always challenge them to go down the street, go down, a couple of streets, and just look at the walls. Don't try to get from A to B looking at the ground to ensure that you don't trip over anything, which is what a lot of us will do, or looking ahead. But look at the walls back and forth. Look maybe to see if there's any chalk art or posters. Look at posters that might be stuck on mailboxes or things like that, and see what you find in your community. And you can get a sense perhaps of the issues that are important to folks. But the other side of that coin, which brings us back to this question, is that there's this resistance, because why am I bringing something into the classroom that is illegal? Now, again, a lot of public art interventions are created legally. There's murals that are, or people paint on their garage doors after having to figure out what they can paint, and other mind-boggling things. So there's a lot that's legal, but I always say that a lot of the legal stuff, a lot of people probably had to vet that idea, and I'm not always sure it is the idea that perhaps the community had in mind. A lot of times these projects are not, no one has a conversation with the community where the mural is going to live, or the public art piece is going to live. I think that's happening more and more, which is great. But sometimes there's like so many voices that have to be included, and it's great to include all these voices, but sometimes they're from people who don't actually live in the community and don't understand the needs of the community, that by the end of it all, you have to wonder if the vision that the artist had in mind is still intact. Yeah. So that's where the illegal stuff is really interesting, because then you have people that are communicating unfiltered. These are their thoughts, and they may be bringing very pressing issues to the forefront for that particular community. So there's always this sort of resistance, like, oh, I shouldn't be bringing this in. I don't want my students to leave the class and start tagging things. And, there should be always this conversation about, what that means, and what you want your students to get out of it. And so I always tell them, it's not like you're teaching them to go and do this, but rather you're showing them what you find on the walls, and maybe you can challenge them to look around the walls of their communities and see the voices of those in the community on these walls. And I'm almost sure you will find something. You may not find a lot. It depends. Different communities, I think, feel more empowered to do that sort of work, but also have more issues that they need to discuss. And so you will find that particular communities, even street by street, you may find a lot of different public art interventions on one street, and then on the following street you don't find as much. So it really depends. But again, it's I think there's this sort of resistance of perhaps not understanding, but also being a little bit worried about something that is perceived as that is illegal if it's done illegally, but also perceived as not being educational.
Yeah, not being either educational or aesthetically pleasing to someone.
That too. Yeah,
You
that
know,
too.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think because not all art is meant to be beautiful. Some art is meant to say something specific about ugly things that are going on, like as you were mentioning. And yeah, and there are, and as Zombie Art Squad points out too, and like the ethics of this, you know, street art, and there are unwritten rules, which kind of leads me to another conversation. And this leads back, I think, to the work you're working to highlight in feminist street art and raising the issues and like opening up a conversation for artists who perhaps don't have the same privileges within the street art or the public art intervention community. With at least through the living room, when we had our legal wall there, and of course there are other kinds of, it's not always just about painting either, it's about stickers, as you're saying, like sometimes rock art. There are different, you know, kinds of ways we rupture outside spaces creatively, and but they're not always welcoming. The streets aren't always welcoming to everyone. What do you say to people who feel, or what kind of conversations have you had with people who feel like they're still on the margins with an art form that is often perceived or hoped to be something that provides voices to those with less privilege?
Yeah, so as part of my dissertation, I interviewed 12 women from all around the world who create different types of public art, both legally and illegally. And I would say 95% of them through their interviews told me that they still find it very, that they're on the margins of of a community because they still find it very difficult to do the work that they want to do for all sorts of different reasons. So even a woman that I had talked to who said that her work is all done legally, she gets harassed sometimes when she is doing her just her work on the street by all sorts of different people will come up to her and say, you know, what are you doing? What, you don't have the right to be here. I'm going to call the police. And even when she explains, well, I've been asked to do this work, but there's still aggression there. And I kind of, when I was doing some research, I kind of brought it back to that being outside and being in public areas. Many of these public areas are made to be unwelcomed on purpose for certain group populations and keep them indoors. And, you know, if we look at history, a lot of politics, negotiating, understanding what goes on in a community happens outdoors, you know, the public square. And it seems like women and people of color and other groups who find themselves sometimes on the margins are made to feel unwelcomed. Now, not everywhere, obviously, but certainly if you're a woman, you're going to probably have some fear of going down an alleyway at midnight to create some work versus someone who is male may not have that sort of fear. So a lot of women would say they would actually work together. But I also heard from another woman who said that, you know, I have to work with a group of women because a lot of times we run into men who are creating as well at night in an alleyway, and it's not always welcoming. So they had some bad experiences. Other women decided that, another woman was just telling me that, you know, she felt that it was just, you know, the anxiety was just too much, that what she was going to do was create a sort of different sort of public art to share with people, public art interventions that didn't require going up and wheat pasting at night in an alleyway. But I look at it as people having to make choices because they're feeling unwelcomed in particular spaces that should be welcoming for everyone. But I think as more and more, if we look on at Instagram and Facebook, a lot of street artists take pictures of themselves as they're creating. And that's great because people see them then in these spaces. They're physically taking up spaces with their bodies, and people get used to that idea that, yes, a woman can paint a mural. That's totally fine. And little girls will see that and they may want to do that work as well. So I think it's just more of like having to realize, open our minds and that kind of thing. But again, it's just this, public space. There's lots of conversations about that right now. Who's allowed in public spaces, and what are they allowed to do in these public spaces? And that's where advertising is kind of interesting, because it's like, oh, if you have the big bucks, you can do whatever you want in public spaces and put up your message. But if you don't have the big bucks and you live in that community, you may have to resort to doing something that is still considered illegal so that your message can get out to the community.
Yeah. Oh, and I wish there was a way. I mean, there is. We're working, I think so many people are working towards decriminalizing things that don't necessarily hurt people. But there's like, it's such a fascinating conversation to be had, particularly within a culture, a creative culture, where there still are gatekeepers with very strong voices who can inform who gets to make art and where they get to make art and how safe they feel doing it. So you are writing a book, yes?
Yeah.
Now, I'm excited about this book because I feel like it will contribute to the conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and where it's at right now?
Yeah, so I'm just at the middle of a second draft, and the book is actually going to focus on talking about using public art interventions in formal education, so like in the classroom, and talk about just having conversations about how it's something that you can bring into the classroom to teach about social justice in a way that will engage your students. So it's not about the students learning how to create it, but rather learning how to look at street art and analyze it. And again, I'm saying street art, but it's, it could be rock art, and it could be posters, protest posters, and all sorts of different types of public art interventions that are out there, bringing that into the classroom to start these conversations. Because a lot of times the work that you find out in the public that's being created by artists bring a different sort of urgency to the classroom, and it's different. The students may find it exciting because it's something that's they see maybe in a music video, or they see beautiful pieces and they're interested in it, or perhaps they are engaged in tagging and that kind of thing. But it's more like, as well, thinking about how you can look at these pieces and use them to refine the skills or develop the skills of critical thinking, because not every piece is, you look at it and you're going to understand it. But if you try to think about where was it located, and who do we think, or who do we know, who created it, if we happen to know who the person is, what is the motivation, what are they trying to tell us? Like, there's a lot of thinking that goes into that, and I think all of that is really helpful in any sort of classroom setting. I'm also very interested in using public art interventions to, teach English as a second language. As I said, I've had this history of looking at language and literacy. It's very important to me. And I was thinking, for someone, because it's so visual, right? And it is something that exists all over the world, it could be a way for someone to connect with a particular issue that they're unable to do through a book or even watching a documentary. But looking at something visually may be able to provide that. And there's a lot of different, field trips that people can do in their communities, see what they can find. And I think with also COVID-19, like so many people that never engaged in these sort of public art activities did, through chalk art, through rock art, through, as you said, putting things in the windows of their homes, stores that put up signage as well. There's a lot there that can be looked at and analyzed and really engage with.
Do you think that things will be different coming out of the pandemic? Do you think that that people will be more willing to have conversations about public art interventions and open to having them in their communities, even if their communities have been fairly conservative?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more openness from the time that I started, which I think would have been 20, when I started to have these conversations, like 2013 or 2014. And I'm still learning. And at that time, I was learning so much. But when I was having conversations with people that I knew, some educators, some not, about the work that I was doing. And there was a lot of like, I want to tell her, you could see it in their faces. Like some people were very direct. Even sometimes doing a public talk, I might have someone who's like, why are you even wasting your time looking at this? There's so many other things you could be looking at. Why are you studying these public art interventions, or vandalism, as many times people would refer to it? And then I would see the faces where it's like, I have questions I want to ask her. I want to tell her maybe she's going, I don't agree with this, but they wouldn't say anything. Too polite, very Canadian, right?
Yeah.
And just being very polite and nodding, and you just kind of see like, and then you have the people that would ask lots of questions, which was great. So the people that are asking a lot of questions, I think I see more of that as years go on. And as I said, it's been a number of years now that I've been looking at public art interventions and doing these studies. And I think I've seen very, even amongst educators, a lot more willingness to talk about it, to try and understand it in the past 10 to 12 years. So I think it's perhaps with COVID, because there was so many, even if you look at news stories in the paper, CBC, for example, because they were lacking people on the street, a lot of times they were using murals or street art to kind of convey something as part of a story. And I thought that was interesting as well, how, even in the media, mainstream media, where stories about street art were very rare. In the past 2 to 3 years, I've seen a lot more. Like in the mainstream, we know alternative media were always covering artists that were doing this type of work, but now I'm seeing it more in the mainstream as well. So I'm hopeful, and I do think that perhaps there will be a different sort of perspective on this type of work, whether it's legal, even if it's illegal. I think there'll be a different perspective on it.
I'm looking forward to that. Because we need more spaces, and I think more safe spaces, so that we have opportunities to learn about all the different creative voices that are out there and what they're trying or wanting or needing to say. And, like, regardless of what modality they choose to express it, if it's like a street art performance or busking or creating that rock or like yarn bombing structure, we need to make space for this kind of expression, because it will happen whether we want it to or not. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to create more safe and constructive conversations with the creators, but also with the community members who will engage with it every day of their lives? I'm just looking to see here that there's, Levislug too. There's thinking about the Freedom Wall in Beijing in the late 1970s and the posters and art that students posted there. It was the beginning of the movement that eventually led to the Tiananmen protests. Again, like it can be something that starts from a very small place, but becomes so powerful to the extent that, the powers that be might want to shut it down. That's another conversation, isn't it? Right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't know if you've heard this story, but it's the Globe and Mail actually covered it a while back, but the Syrian War was sparked by graffiti that was written on a wall by a teenager who was saying, I don't know I don't have the right words, but it was something essentially saying that the president was next. So this happened during the Arab Spring. And I use that when I'm talking as an example of how powerful writing on a wall can be, to the point that, these teenagers that were involved in that did this, they were arrested and tortured, and that's what led to the Syrian War. And I'm like, this is very complex, and I'm of course explaining this in a couple of sentences, but if you
Yeah.
Google Syrian War and Graffiti and Globe and Mail, that article will come up, and it talks about that. The other thing I wanted to point out or talk about is that if we have time,
Sure, we do.
there's a wonderful artist in Yemen. Her name is Haifa Subay, Haifa, and Subay, Subay.
Yes.
And the work that she does in very dangerous conditions is bringing attention to the civil war in Yemen. And it's very important, this work that she's doing, because it's getting international eyes. So she will, in her street art that she's creating, and she refers to it as street art, her murals, she is depicting things that are happening due to the civil war, such as famine, people losing their limbs, and that kind of thing. And this is really important because, oh, thank you, Zombie Art Squad, that's posted that Graffiti Kids of Syria, because it's a really interesting story that showcases the power, for sure, of that kind of public art. But Haifa, she, through her work, she's bringing attention to things that aren't being covered in the mainstream media. What is happening in Yemen, they've had a civil war for 5 years now, 5 to 6 years, and it's been not really covered in the mainstream. But as well, journalists there in that country are censored about what they can report on, and the government is not allowing international journalists to go in to cover it. And so that's perhaps why we have this gap or void in mainstream media about the civil war that's been going on. But her art, because people take pictures of it and share it via social media, it caught the attention of people who found out more about the civil war and how it's affecting people there through her art. And she ended up going to Singapore to do an exhibit. But I would say that this type of art actually takes the place of newspapers or journalism. She's able to inform people on what's happening in that country that is not being either reported because they can't, or people are just not interested. And she's doing that through her work.
Yeah, yeah. I think of other artists here. We have Wendigo Army that are doing the same. And it's so striking because sometimes when we're talking about the street art, or I love the term, I will steal it from you now and always credit you, public art interventions.
Yes.
People say, why? Like, why do that? You know, you can make a living or try to make a living as an artist by creating canvases or videos, or, you know, there's so many other ways. But I think what you just highlighted there says it all. Like, you create a piece about an issue or something that matters to you, and if someone purchases it or a gallery exhibits it, it's in this very limited space in someone's home or in a private space that you have to gain entry to appreciate it and to learn from it. And then even when you do, you're missing the context of what might surround it and enhance that experience. But for anyone I know, including little kids doing chalk art, or for, you know, my mom painting a rock and putting it out, you know, in the corner in someone's garden, all of these things are meant or hoped to connect with a broader audience and create those connections and spark that reflection, that curiosity or investigation. And that's open to anyone. It's open to anyone and everyone, no matter who you are, how much money you have, whether you're an art appreciator or not. That's something that I just love about this work. And it's one of the things for me that makes it so important. Not a question in there, just a ramble, just a rant, just a little bit of a rant.
Yeah, I mean, all of what you're saying is exactly what the sort of things that we should be thinking about, and not so much about, oh, it's vandalism. You know, a lot of people will tell me, tagging, how can you look at tagging? I don't study tagging, but I appreciate it because it's a language. It's a form of communication that a group is using to communicate with each other. And we may not agree with the way that it's happening, but we do have to look at it and say, this is a way that people are communicating, and maybe ask ourselves, why do they choose to communicate that way? You know, if it is something that is impacting. And I've had people also say, well, you've never been impacted by any sort of vandalism. But yeah, I actually have. So my husband and I had a store on Queen Street East, and once in a while it would get tagged, and we would clean it up, and because the city requires that you clean it up. But when I was in Portugal a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting to see how the streets, there's tagging, there's graffiti, there's street art, there's all sorts of public art interventions happening on the house, like on the sides of the houses that are on main streets and also quiet streets. And there was a lot of it. And I thought, I guess the city is fine with this sort of, public art happening. They're not making people clean it up, or at least it didn't seem to me. There was a lot, and it was fascinating to me to be able to see how different people were communicating and how it would change from one street to the other. And as well, you would see people respecting property. I didn't see, for example, a church have any tagging on it. Perhaps it does exist. I didn't see it. I saw a couple of monuments. There was nothing on it. There seemed to be this sort of like, we're going to use this wall to communicate, but we're not going to use this because we don't want to interfere. And that actually was something one of the street artists I spoke to said that they would take into consideration where they were placing the illegal public art intervention they were creating, because they would think about, is this going to impact a business owner who now will have to pay, or themselves, they have to clean it? Will this impact their business? Will this impact the resident? They would put a lot of thought into it. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm just going to put something over there. But they also thought about the location in terms of their message and how they wanted people to receive that message. So a particular spot in the community, or a particular place outside of their community, but on a street where they knew they would get people looking at it, but that wouldn't impact a person who owns a business. So there was lots of thought being put into this.
And I think too, that's one of the, as an ally to street artists, and that was a conversation we would have at the living room all the time. The business that was beside us they had a lovely wall that would always get tagged or spray painted. But once we started connecting with artists and letting them know that if they didn't pay to have it removed themselves, they would get fined by the city. It wasn't their choice whether they, wanted to have art on the side of their building or not. They didn't have the agency to make that call. The artists began to change, and you began to, word would get around. And so there is, I think, this lovely thing that begins to happen if we're willing to have a conversation about it and learn more about it, and learn more about what these, what the communities are going through, what the artists are going through, what the communities want or need versus what the artists want or need, or the powers that be want or need. It's an exciting creative process.
I think so. Yeah, I think it is. And I think there's more openness, as I've seen, and I'm sure anyone who does this work will know that there's more openness now for this type of work, whether it's illegal or legal, or at least under an attempt to understand. I mean, Banksy has a lot to do with that. So, again, whenever I mention the research that I do, it's like, oh, like Banksy. Well, yeah. So, I mean, there's that association, and then suddenly it's, oh, well, I can buy it at the store, a Banksy, or I see it being sold at a gallery. And so, I mean, I think that is good in a way that has provided a bit more openness towards, seeing the potential of public art interventions. But at the same time, it's important to take a look at the people that are creating in their own communities. And it's not all about the big names, or the people even who are creating these huge murals and have permission because they're parachuted in for a festival and then they leave and they know nothing about the community, but rather looking at the people who live in that community and want to communicate the very important issues that are affecting them there through these public art interventions.
Not even about what's beautiful or what's not, I
exactly.
think there's so much, and that's what makes all these places we live, work, study, and play in so diverse and exciting. And I think Levislug 2 has posted also the murals of Yemen's, the Haifa, so that's beautiful.
Thank
Haifa
you.
Soubey. So
yes.
Folks, you can check out the links to learn more. I guess we are running out of time, even though I did start late. So any final thoughts or messages you'd like to send out there to the community or share with folks about what you're passionate about and what you're doing?
So I think that although as I said, I kind of connect the work that I'm doing with public pedagogy, it still goes back to literacy with me, because I see, again, it's another kind of area that I've looked at. It was a little bit in my dissertation, but it would require a bit more reflection, analysis, and research, really. But connecting these public art interventions to literacy, how can we use them, not outside of the classroom, because not everyone has an opportunity to go to a classroom, and even if they do, they may not learn there because it's not that formal, traditional, standardized everything curriculum. It doesn't work for everyone. But how can we take a look at public art interventions and teach about language, and teach about literacy, and teach about history, teach about all sorts of different subjects in a way that perhaps works better for folks? So one part of me is like analyzing all of the communication that's happening. And then the other piece, which I think is more where the research of my book is going to, is really what it's talking about, is how can we harness this power? And we know it's powerful, and it empowers people, and it informs people. But how can we harness all of this and bring it into formal education that really needs to be, needs a shake up. It's still we're stuck in the old ways of doing things. There's wonderful educators out there that are trying to do their best, but curriculum, really keeps them like having to do things every year. And I really feel that this is one thing that can kind of bring a different perspective on how to learn and how to teach using these kinds of public art interventions that are available to anyone. All you need to do is just look at the walls, look at the streets, look at the rocks, and take the time to like think about those messages. And just, that's all I can say, is I think there's a lot of power in terms of knowledge that we can harness from public art interventions. So I hope that will happen more in the future.
I hope so too, Anna. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, folks, there's so many wonderful people watching out there. They will time us out at any minute now, but I just want to say thank you so much. I feel like there's a whole part 2 of this chat that we could have. So maybe one day in the future, maybe when your book is released or when it's closer, we'll have you back, maybe.
Yes, for sure. And the book will be published by Fernwood Publishing, and hopefully it will be out in spring of 2022. So not too far, but again, with publishing, sometimes it takes a little bit longer. But yes, I would love to come back and then just talk about the ideas in the book.
Oh, I can't wait. Okay, it's a date. Some date in the future. But thank you so much for being here.
Mary, thank you. And thank you for all that you do for the community, and facilitating these spaces so that we can have these conversations. They're happening because of you. So thank you so much. I do appreciate everything that you're doing, and all the work that you put, and everyone appreciates it, as you know. And you've come to talk to my students a couple of times now. So I do appreciate everything, all of the knowledge that you share with us so willingly. So thank you.
Knowledge transfer, skill shares. That's what we do. Artists, we do things. I have a very hard time accepting compliments and thank you. But I will say thank you. I'll do that. But we will have you back, and thank you for sharing your art and your heart, all of this and more. As always, it's a pleasure connecting with you.
Yes. So take care. Have a great rest of summer. And thank you again. Thanks, everyone. I loved seeing all the different comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a feeling you might have a few folks reach out to you.
Oh, yes, feel free. I would love to hear from anyone, artists, people researching public art, everyone. Yeah, educators.
And so if people want to connect with you, is Instagram at Pop-Up Pedagogy the best place to do it?
Pop-Up Pedagogy. I also have a website, and I'm on Twitter, but if you just go to Pop-Up Pedagogy, it takes you to my website, and my email is there if you want to send me an email.
Fantastic. Okay, folks, you heard it here first. Get in contact if you'd like to learn more. Thank you so much, Anna. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thanks. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye, Anna.
Bye.
That was awesome, wasn't it? Folks, thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you to Dr. Anna Rodrigues and Pop-Up Pedagogy for joining us too. Please, yeah, do connect if you'd like to learn more about Anna and the work that they're doing, and have a conversation with her about the public art interventions and why they matter. It gets me thinking, just about a reminder to get out there, and when you do have an opportunity to see it, even in your own neighborhoods, you might not live in a downtown somewhere you traditionally might think of finding street art or those kind of arts, those public arts interventions, but just get curious, look around. You never know what you're going to see. And there might be people in your community. You might be one of those people in your community who's looking to connect and communicate something to the world that might not otherwise be able to happen if it wasn't for that creative outlet. So get curious, get out there and see what's there. Thanks so much to everyone who joined us for the live stream today. Thank you again to Anna. And just a reminder that next week, the next 2 weeks actually, the first 2 weeks of August, we're going to be taking a little break here at the Living Room from all our online programming. I'm going to go hug some trees, but I'm also going to, we're going to start planning what we're doing in the fall. So keep an eye out for some exciting stuff happening once we're back from our break. But in the meantime, until we can connect and create with one another in person, I look forward to connecting with you right here online. I'll be back on Facebook tomorrow, Wednesday, from pop-up live stream time or pop-up live stream art studio time. We've got all the events on Facebook. So go to Facebook, check it out, see what's happening this week. See you soon, folks. Mwah. Bye.